Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Oh, there.
Today, we're taking a plunge into a really pivotal figure in political thought, Niccolò Machiavelli.
Mm-hmm. For better or worse, as you say.
Exactly. We're looking at excerpts from his big ones, The Prince and the Art of War, and we're using a collection of translations and some introductory notes to sort of guide us.
Right. And our mission here really is to get past the caricature, the whole Machiavellian label, and really unpack his core ideas, how states are won, how they're kept going, how they're defended.
Using his own words as much as possible.
Exactly. And see what our sources point to as the really key insights from his work.
Okay, so let's dive in. To get Machiavelli, you really have to get the world he lived in. Our sources paint a picture of Italy that's, well, pretty grim.
Oh, absolutely. It was chaos. You have to understand that. The sources talk about the period starting around, 1494. They call it a time of great fears, the Sodain flights, and the marvelous losses. Basically, powerful states just collapsing.
Yeah, the descriptions are brutal. Italy is called enslaved, downtrodden, disunited, beaten, despoiled, mangled, overrun, and desolate. I mean, that's intense.
And it wasn't abstract for him. This was his reality. He saw the Florentine Republic he served just, fall apart.
And he suffered personally, too, right? The sources mention that.
They do, big time. Banned from the government buildings, arrested. And then there's that chilling phrase the source uses, decorously tortured with 6 turns of the rack.
Decorously tortured. Wow. It just sticks with you, doesn't it? Tells you a lot about the political climate.
It really does. But interestingly, the sources also try to balance this, to push back against that purely evil, cynical image of him.
Oh, so.
Well, they point to his personal letters. There's one quoted telling his family, "Tell your mother with my love not to be nervous. Give a kiss to Bocchina, Piero, and Toto. Be happy and spend as little as you may. Christ have you in his keeping."
Huh. That sounds surprisingly normal.
Huh.
Human, even.
Right, and the source explicitly says there are many such letters and they were not written by a bad man. It suggests this separation between his political analysis, which is stark, and maybe his personal life.
That separation feels like a recurring theme. And speaking of controversial stuff, his view on the church, pretty harsh.
Oh, yeah. The sources highlight this bitter critique. He basically blamed the church's temporal power for having ruined Italy and debauched the world, stripping Italians of both religion and liberty.
But wait, didn't he also see some value in religion itself? The source mentions that too, I think.
Yes, exactly. And that's where it gets nuanced. He slammed the church as an institution for its political role in dividing Italy. But the source notes elsewhere he suggests religion can be an essential element in a strong state.
So useful for keeping order.
Kind of useful for fostering civic virtue, unity, that sort of thing. Even if he hated what the actual church was doing to Italy, he could condemn someone like Savonarola, but still admire Dante, It's about the pragmatic function for the state, separate from belief or institutional power.
Okay. So given this chaotic backdrop, his own rough experiences, what was he actually trying to do with these writings? What was the goal?
Well, our sources frame it as very analytical, very practical. He wanted to observe, to compare, to diagnose, to analyze, and to formulate principles of government. And the big radical idea, which the source points out, was this judicial separation between the morals of a man and the morals of a prince.
Meaning the rule book is different for rulers.
That's pretty much it. He wasn't writing a how to be good manual. He was writing a how to stay in power and keep your state safe manual in a really dangerous world.
Right.
The source says he wanted to use knowledge for the advancement of good, meaning the state's good and the means didn't matter as much as long as they were apt and moderate in accordance with necessity.
Necessity being the key word.
Absolutely. And underlying it all, the sources suggest, was this deep patriotism, a desire to see Italy strong and unified.
Okay, that focus on necessity, on what works rather than just what's virtuous, that really takes us into The Prince, doesn't it? Let's get into that. How states are gained and kept. He starts with hereditary versus new states.
Yeah, the hereditary ones. Relatively easy street, according to Machiavelli. The source quotes him saying, "You just need not to transgress the course his ancestors took, and so afterward to temporize with those accidents that can happen. Basically, don't rock the boat too much, follow tradition, adapt a bit."
But the new ones, especially those added onto an existing state, mixed principalities, he calls them. That's where the trouble starts.
That's the real challenge, yeah. If you gain power relying on others, the source points out, you immediately become suspected by him that has grown puissant, by the very people who helped you. You owe them, but you also kind of fear their power. It's tricky.
He uses some pretty stark historical examples for holding on to conquered places. Spartans versus Romans.
Right. The Spartans tried setting up friendly oligarchies in places like Athens and Thebes and lost them, the Romans. They held Capua, Carthage, Numantia by, well, dismantling them.
Dismantling them, like destroying them.
Pretty much. It leads to that really famous or infamous line quoted in the source, "There is not a surer way to keep them under than by demolishments."
Wow. Why so extreme?
Because, he argues, if a city is used to freedom, used to its own laws, and you conquer it but leave it intact, it will always remember that freedom. The source says it will use liberty for refuge and the ancient orders to rebel sooner or later.
So it's total control or eventual loss.
From his brutally pragmatic view, yes. You either crush its identity or risk it rising against you.
Okay. He also discusses how someone can rise to power from being a private citizen, ways that aren't just about luck or traditional virtue, wicked means or citizen favor.
Ah, yes, the wicked means. This is where you get figures like Agathocles of Syracuse. Rose from being a potter, apparently, through just awful cruelty. But Machiavelli notes he also had incredible courage and military skill.
So bad guy, but capable.
Extremely capable. And then there's Oliverado de Fermo, who murdered his own uncle and city leaders to grab power. But the key thing the source highlights isn't just the wickedness, it's why they were hard to beat after they got power. Agathocles had military virtue in the practical sense. Oliverado immediately set up new civil and military orders to lock down his control.
Although Oliverado got outsmarted eventually, didn't he?
He did. The source notes he was deceived by Caesar Borgia, so even skilled wickedness isn't foolproof.
Okay, so that's the dark path. What about rising through the favor of the citizens?
This comes from what Machiavelli sees as a basic tension everywhere. The people just want not to be bossed around and oppressed, while the great ones, the nobles, the elite, they want to command and oppress.
So siding with the people is easier.
Generally, yes. If the people lift you up, their main desire is just not to be crushed, which is easier for a prince to satisfy if he keeps them friendly.
But if the nobles put you in charge,
then it's tougher. You absolutely have to win over the people too, because the nobles have their own ambitions. Machiavelli really stresses that a prince needs his citizens to feel like they always need his government, especially in doubtful times, crises.
Because otherwise they might just listen to their local bosses or whoever they're used to.
Exactly. If their loyalty isn't directly to you, the prince, when things get shaky, they might not stick by you.
Right. Okay, so moving from getting power to actually keeping it, what qualities does a ruler need? This is where he really departs from, like traditional morality guides.
Totally. The source stresses he's focused on the effectual truth of the matter than the imagination thereof. He's looking at what actually works for rulers, not some ideal. And rulers are judged by what people see. Appearance is key.
Which leads to that famous paradox about virtues.
The very one. He says, look, a prince doesn't actually need to be good in the traditional sense. Pitiful, faithful, mild, religious, and of integrity, as the source lists them. But he absolutely has to seem to be all those things.
Seem to be, but be ready to act differently.
Precisely. He needs the ability, the flexibility, to act in the contrary way when the state's survival demands it. The source explicitly notes this clashes with conventional ethics.
It's the classic ends justify the means idea applied to the state.
Pretty much. The effectiveness and necessity for the state are the measures. Take his point on generosity versus miserliness.
Right. Being generous sounds good, but he says it's bad.
It's counterintuitive, but yeah. Constant, lavish generosity, the source explains, just burns through your money. Then you have to tax people heavily, become a great exactor, and everyone starts hating you.
And hatred is the big danger zone.
The biggest. So getting a reputation for being miserable, which means thrifty, careful with money, not necessarily greedy, that's a vice that, according to the source, does not pluck him from his throne. It actually lets you defend the state and run things without bleeding the people dry. It's the lesser evil for a ruler.
Okay. Then there's the really controversial one, keeping your word, breaking promises.
Yeah, this is probably peak Machiavellian. He argues a prince shouldn't feel bound by his promises if sticking to them puts him or the state at a disadvantage.
Why?
Because, as the source quotes him, men themselves are full of mischief and won't keep their promises to you. So why should you be the only one playing by the rules? It's about surviving in a world that isn't always trustworthy.
And he says you can always make excuses.
He suggests a prince shall never want lawful occasions to give color to this breach. You can always find a good reason, or spin one, for breaking your word when you need to.
So look trustworthy, but be ready to ditch promises. What else is crucial for staying in power? Avoiding being hated and contempt.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Paramount. The source pinpoints the two big ways to get hated. Extortion of his subjects' goods and abuse of their women. Don't steal people's stuff, don't mess with their families. Basic, but crucial.
And avoiding contempt. Being looked down on.
Yeah. Don't seem variable, light, effeminate, faint-hearted, unresolved. Project strength, seriousness, decisiveness. People need to respect your authority, not just fear it, but definitely not despise it.
Makes sense. What about actual threats? Where do they come from?
Two main places, he says. From inside your subjects' plotting and from outside powerful neighbors.
How do you handle those?
Against external threats, good weapons, and good allies. And here's a key Machiavellian point the source highlights. Good weapons get you good allies. Strength attracts friends. And internal security. That mostly relies on being strong externally. If you look solid against outsiders, people inside are less likely to cause trouble. Unless, there's a specific conspiracy brewing.
He uses examples, right? Like France managing its nobles with parliament.
Yes, France had parliament as a check on the nobles, which took some heat off the king. And the Roman emperors. They had this constant balancing act between keeping the soldiers happy and keeping the people happy. Very difficult.
The sources mention specific emperors.
They do. Marcus Aurelius, good guy, hereditary ruler, kept things in line. Pertinax, also good, but couldn't handle the undisciplined soldiers, got killed. Septimius Severus, very cunning, knew how to play the foxes and the lions parts, used both cleverness and cruelty to balance soldiers and people. And Maximinus, tough soldier but hated for his cruelty and low birth, overthrown. It shows how tricky managing those internal power groups is.
Sounds like you can even use challenges to your advantage sometimes.
He suggests that, yeah.
Right.
Overcoming opposition actually builds your reputation. Sometimes, he muses, fortune throws enemies at a new prince specifically so he can beat them and look good.
He even suggests creating enemies.
The source mentions the provocative idea that a wise prince might cunningly to nourish some enmity. Just for that purpose, to have someone to defeat publicly. A bit cynical, maybe?
Just a bit. What about trust? Who should a prince rely on?
Interestingly, the source notes Machiavelli observed that sometimes you get more faith and profit from people you initially suspected than from your original inner circle. He cites Pandolfus Petrucci of Siena. People you win over might be more grateful and loyal.
And physical defenses. Fortresses, good idea or bad idea?
It's pragmatic. The sources say fortresses can be useful bridles on the population, but they're dangerous if the prince relies on them instead of securing the people's loyalty. If the people hate you, no fortress will save you eventually.
He gives examples of tearing them down.
Yeah, Vitelli demolished fortresses in one town. Ubaldo raised them when he got his state back. They preferred popular support over stone walls.
Okay, what if you're stuck between two powerful neighbors? Stay neutral.
Generally, no. Neutrality is often harmful, the source argues Machiavelli believed. If you have to choose, pick the stronger side. But he admits it's tough. Whensoever a man seeks to avoid one inconvenient, he incurs another. It's about choosing the least bad option, minimizing risk.
And advisors. How do you get good advice without just getting flattered?
Flattery. He called it a pestilence. His solution, according to the source, control the flow of truth. Give only a select few wise men permission to tell you the truth, and only about things you specifically ask them about, of what he demands, and no more.
So limited, controlled honesty.
Exactly. Keeps you grounded without opening the floodgates to constant criticism or endless advice, and maintains respect.
So putting it all together, why did the Italian princes he knew lose their states? Naples, Milan.
Yeah.
They collapsed.
The sources point to a couple of main reasons. First, a common defect touching their arms, basically. Military weakness, poor organization. We'll get more into that with the art of war.
Right.
And second, just bad management of their own people. They either alienated the common folk or couldn't control the nobles. And the source gives this scathing description of what they were focused on before 1494.
What was that?
Things like knowing how to make a subtle answer, to write a goodly letter, deck themselves with precious stones and gold, to sleep and to eat with greater glory than other, basically just rotting in idleness.
Focusing on the fancy stuff, not the fundamentals.
Exactly. Image over substance. Luxury over military readiness. That made them, as the source puts it, a prey to whomsoever should assault them. easy targets.
That failure in military strength is the perfect lead-in to the art of war, isn't it?
It really is. And the source presents this book as a dialogue. You have this figure, Fabrizio Colonna, who basically voices Machiavelli's ideas, debating old Roman military ways versus the pretty lousy contemporary Italian methods he saw.
And Fabrizio's main point is that war shouldn't be a full-time job for citizens.
Correct. In a well-run state, he argues, war is a duty, not a profession or an arte. The problem is mercenaries, these perilous men, he calls them, they turn war into a business.
Which causes problems.
Huge problems. They lack loyalty, they lack discipline. The source explicitly blames Italy's ruin on reliance on mercenary captains like Alberic, Braccio, Sforza. It says this system left Italy open to being overrun by Charles, pillaged by Louis, forced by Ferdinand, and disgraced by the Swissers. Total disaster.
And he contrasts this with the Romans.
Yeah, he brings up examples like Regulo Attilio, the Roman general, who apparently wanted leave from the army to go home and check on his farm because his manager had died. They served when needed, then went back to their lives.
So this feeds into Machiavelli's push for a national militia. The sources mention he tried to set one up himself.
Absolutely. That was fundamental for him. You needed an army drawn from your own subjects, your own citizens. He argued for getting a great number from your own country, even if they're inexperienced, because without the same, there's nothing sure. Their loyalty is presumably to their own state.
Where should you recruit from? City or country?
He preferred men from the country, maybe seeing them as tougher or less corrupted than city dwellers. And he had specific ideas about age ranges for new armies versus replenishing existing ones.
And he keeps talking about order. Military order.
Yes, he defends military discipline and organization passionately. He argues that people who criticize traditional military order are confusing bad execution with a bad idea. Armed citizens, properly organized and disciplined, are the only reliable way to secure a state.
He criticizes others, like Venice and France.
He does. Venice relied too much on foreigners for land warfare. France disarmed its own people to rule them easier. Both mistakes, in his view, that weaken them.
And discipline takes training.
Crucial, especially for new guys. Leaders need to set an example, honesty and shame. And he points to Roman drills, throwing heavy darts, using slings, archery. These built skill and obedience. Order in battle, he says, comes from following the flags, the ensigns, which in turn follow the drum signals. Clear communication, clear structure.
How did those Roman legions actually fight, according to him?
He describes their classic formation, the hastati in front, then the principi, then the triarii in the third line. And he really highlights that amazing Roman tactic of being able to cycle the lines.
Cycle them.
Yeah, receive one rank back through the gaps in the rank behind it. So the front line fights, gets tired, falls back through the second line, and fresh troops from the second line move up. It allows continuous pressure without exhausting everyone. Really clever.
He also had strong views on infantry versus cavalry.
Very strong. He believes states that valued horses over foot soldiers were always weak and subject to all ruin. He points to Italy again. For him, disciplined infantry was the core, the backbone.
Did he think different troops feared different things?
Yeah, he mentions the Spanish feared cavalry, the Swiss feared infantry, suggesting a smart commander could maybe create a mixed force or use tactics to exploit those specific fears.
Okay, what about the big game changer of his era? Artillery. Cannons. Did he think they made all the old Roman stuff obsolete?
No, interestingly, he acknowledged artillery was powerful, it breaks orders, smashes through armor, but he argued it wasn't insurmountable.
How do you deal with it then?
You find ways to minimize its impact. Move quickly, use terrain for cover, though he admits cover is hard in a pitched battle. His basic idea seems to be, artillery is slow, needs open ground, it's vulnerable, ancient formations, being flexible and agile, could adapt, and his core principle comes up again. Things you absolutely cannot withstand, you have to avoid. Don't stand there and let the cannons pound you if you can move.
What other tactical points does he cover?
Oh, lots. Like, should you attack loudly to scare the enemy and boost your own morale, or silently to maintain order? How to use the sun and wind, using rivers or swamps to protect your flank or make a smaller force hold out longer.
And tricks. Stratagems.
Definitely. The source lists a bunch drawn from history, pretending to retreat to lure the enemy into a trap. Ambushes, obviously. Spreading false rumors the enemy commander is dead, we've won a battle elsewhere.
Anything else?
Forcing your own troops to fight by blocking their retreat. He mentions Philip of Macedonia doing that, dividing the enemy by attacking their home territory, making the enemy distrust their own soldiers, like Scipio did to Antiochus's troops.
So it's a lot about mind games, not just force.
Absolutely. Outthinking the opponent is key. And knowing when not to fight is just as important.
When should you avoid battle?
If the enemy is clearly stronger, or if they're desperate fighting with their backs to the wall. Sometimes he suggests if the enemy is in despair, the best thing is just to sit tight in your fortified camp and let them wreck themselves trying to attack you.
Logistics also sound way different in his ideal ancient model.
Yeah, much simpler. Fabricio praises the Romans for drinking water mixed with vinegar, not needing wine convoys, baking bread on the spot from meal and lard, maybe driving cattle along for meat, instead of relying on fragile supply lines carrying pre-baked bread like they did in Machiavelli's time. Less stuff to carry, more self-sufficient.
And fighting in winter.
Generally a bad idea. The source calls it undiscreet or more perilous, especially for the attacker.
Siege warfare gets a lot of attention too. How did he think cities should be fortified, especially with cannons around?
Right, cannons made high walls vulnerable, but low walls are easy to climb. So his clever idea, mentioned in the source, was high walls, but with a ditch on the inside at the base.
A ditch inside?
Yeah, ditches within. So if attackers get over the wall, they fall into a ditch inside the city where defenders can easily deal with them. He also said houses near the wall should be flimsy, easy to knock down so attackers can't use them for cover if they breach the wall.
What about smaller forts?
He thought small fortresses were basically undefendable, and he warned against having multiple strong points within a fortress where defenders could retreat. He cites the fortress of Forli, thought impregnable, which fell because the defenders kept falling back to inner defenses, which were then picked off one by one. Don't give yourself places to retreat to within the walls.
How should you defend during a siege?
First, stock up. Avoid famine. If the walls are breached, you fight from high places and from the houses and from the towers. Use the city itself as your defense, and watch out for enemy tricks.
Like what?
Like offering pardons only to unarmed citizens to try and divide the population, or secretly opening gates. He mentions Scipio and Pyrrhus using deception to weaken or trick garrisons. You have to be wary.
What about mining under the walls?
The remedy was deep ditches outside the walls, or building on solid rock. Gunpowder changed mining, though. It could ruinate a wall, but also just blow open hillsides, creating breaches.
Throughout all this military talk, the captain, the leader, seems critical.
Absolutely central. A captain's reputation, built on virtue, meaning skill, courage, effectiveness, is what holds an army together, more than noble birth or just formal authority. A good captain knows how to punish fairly and reward appropriately.
What about things like omens, superstition?
Ancient captains were pragmatic. They'd either interpret bad omens favorably for the troops, or act so quickly the soldiers didn't have time to worry about them. Keep morale up, keep moving.
And this all comes back around to his critique of the Italian princes.
Exactly. Their failures, he argued, stemmed from this profound ignorance of war, this focus on luxury and appearances, idleness, the source calls it, instead of cultivating real military strength based on their own people and sound principles. They were unprepared, easily rolled over.
The sources suggest a sense of personal reflection from Machiavelli at the end of The Art of War.
They do. Despite his age, he shared this knowledge with grave young men, hoping they'd use it for their rulers, for Italy's benefit. He clearly believed Italy could recover, raise up again the thingies, if they just adopted these older, proven methods.
There's a bit of sadness there, too.
Yeah, a poignant feeling. He felt maybe he'd gained the knowledge too late, or lacked the power to implement it when he was younger, but his conviction was strong. Only Italians themselves, using the right way, the way he showed, could restore Italy's military reputation. Not relying on corrupted strangers, mercenaries. The source ends his thoughts with that powerful line. Nor never believe that reputation will be gotten by the Italians' weapons, but by the same way that I have showed.
Wow. Okay, so bringing this all together for you listening, we covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
Machiavelli's world, his life, his incredibly pragmatic, sometimes jarring analysis of power in The Prince and warfare in The Art of War.
Yeah, we've looked at how he saw states being won and lost, the tough realities of leadership, his detailed thoughts on military organization, strategy, tactics.
And it's really striking, isn't it, how these ideas born out of 16th century Italy still make you think.
They absolutely do. His observations about, human nature, the dynamics of power, the need for solid foundations versus just looking good, adapting to tough situations, the gap between appearance and reality.
It feels relevant way beyond just politics or war.
For sure. You can see echoes in how organizations are run, maybe even in personal effectiveness, that need for clear-eyed assessment and sometimes difficult choices.
Well, that was our deep dive into Niccolò Machiavelli, drawing on our sources for The Prince and the Art of War. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. It was fascinating to revisit.
And as a final thought to leave you with, something building on what we've discussed, Machiavelli blamed Italy's troubles on princes who chased comfort and image, got lazy, and relied on others for defense instead of building their own strength. So consider this. What happens today, in any field, when leaders prioritize the superficial, rely too much on external factors, and neglect building that fundamental capability and resilience within their own teams, organizations, or even nations? Something to ponder.